Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Jaccard. I'm a professor in the School of Resource and Environmental Management at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. And I've been given an opportunity to speak about my latest book, The Citizen's Guide to Climate Success, and I very much appreciate this opportunity. Now, I'm an expert on the economics and policy related to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, and I've been working in that area for 3 decades. And in that time, I've seen how much there is still a lot of misinformation about the things we do know and the things we don't know about how we can be effective in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so the motive for my book is literally to help people, non-experts, so what I'm calling climate concerned citizens, and helping them to detect sometimes what are deliberate delusions, sometimes what are inadvertent myths. And by doing that, to help them have a better chance of electing climate sincere politicians who will do effective policies and even set the stage, which we're getting close to now, where we can take our own actions to eliminate almost all of our personal emissions. And I'm going to emphasize even just 2 things. So the point is to try to help people understand how the problem is a lot simpler if you look at what the things the experts agree on. And I'm involved in that process again right now. I'm an intergovernmental panel on climate change author, and we're working on the next assessment. And I'm writing in the policy section, so this is very immediate to me right now. And I want to start out with a couple of quotes, because these are fun quotes. There are many quotes in the book, but here's one from Upton Sinclair, who was an American writer almost a century ago, saying, "It's difficult to get someone to understand something when their salary depends on them not understanding it." And I mean, we can all have a little smile when we read something like that. But I think it is a very revealing quote, and it helps us to understand others and maybe sometimes ourselves. And so that's more where self-interest prevails, but it isn't just self-interest that can drive us to, be so selective in our evidence. And Bertrand Russell, a philosopher writing this about 100 years ago, said, "What someone believes on grossly insufficient evidence is an index into their desires." Now, in this book, I actually spend a fair bit of time talking about not, dealing with the delusions of necessarily the ones that Upton Sinclair is talking about, the deliberate ones, but more the ones where people connect in other aspirations or goals that they have, or strong feelings that aren't necessarily consistent with what the experts are finding, and that by doing that, they actually make the challenge greater than it need be. And so, one way I talk about that is say, if we were able to apply critical thinking to the challenges of decarbonization, what are the things that experts do agree on? And the first thing is they say we have to stop burning fossil fuels. Now, you all know that. I'll use the term decarbonize. It's our latest jargon term. But in doing that, I want to simplify it down again to 3 key challenges. The first is to remember that fossil fuels are actually an incredible form of energy. We keep telling ourselves, or some among us keep saying, "Oh, fossil fuels are expensive," and it's easy to get rid of, other forms of energy to be cheaper. But that's not really what the experts see. What they say is fossil fuels are high quality and low cost. Their price falls and will keep falling, especially as we try to switch away from them. And fossil fuels have been and continue to be the dominant form of energy because of their low cost and their high quality for development. And I'm just showing on a graph there the CO2 emissions of a development that is familiar to all of us now, of China rapidly increasing its emissions as it rapidly increased economic growth because of not only its use of coal, but also its rapidly increased use in oil, and even now to some extent natural gas. And that's a similar pattern for other countries. And the important thing to remember, as I show with this next slide shows over time, the black columns are the net growth or decline in fossil fuels, and the green columns are the net growth and decline in renewables. And you can see that as we headed towards, there was a period there when fossil fuel investments were going down. In fact, it was right until the Paris Agreement. So you see that red arrow going down, and renewables actually, in 1 year or two, our investment, our expansion of production with renewables was equal to or exceeded fossil fuels, and then the curve started back again. So I've been involved in this game since 1990, and I've heard people saying since 1990 that renewables are winning, and yet since that time, you see that in virtually every year, it's fossil fuels that are winning. Now, it may not be in your particular country, it may not be in Canada that's happening. This is what's going on around the world, and that's the important thing to think about, because the solution to this problem can only be a global solution. Now, so that first myth is that fossil fuels are expensive. The second myth is that we can voluntarily reach a global agreement. And so that's been the basis for 27, 28 years of negotiations. And I feel a bit funny putting this cartoon up there because it's kind of a black humor cartoon, but basically countries have gotten together every year now for 25 or 27 years. And the premise of those get-togethers and the negotiations that they undertake are that they could voluntarily reach an agreement that everyone would be satisfied with. That you wouldn't have some people saying, oh, no, you have to pay us, we're poorer countries, and the other side saying, oh, well, we'd like to pay you, but we can't pay you that much. But that's the reality that's been going on. And it's meant that people haven't talked about putting on carbon tariffs. And so, experts I knew said 25 years ago, these negotiations are silly. They wrote books about it. You have to have tariffs. You have to have carrots and sticks. That's how any global agreement works, unless it happens to be mutually beneficial for everyone, but identically, and it's not going to be. And so we've had these failed negotiations. It's nice to hear there's a bit more talk now about carbon tariffs, both in Europe, Canada, and now hopefully even the United States. And then the third myth is that the domestic policy debates will be honest. Now, I've written about this for a couple of decades, and now it doesn't seem in a Trump era, and I'd like to think we're in a post-Trump era, but some of the things that Trump has helped to cause about just such bias in information through the media, for example, is something that has always gone on. But it really looms large in domestic policy debates about climate. And one reason is that, of course, fossil fuels are incumbent, so there's a financial self-interest that motivates corporations and individuals to trumpet their benefits. But also, because you're trying to transition this decarbonization over a lengthy period of time, it makes it easy for climate insincere politicians to fake it by setting distant targets and then not really implementing the policies you need to achieve them. And it means that climate sincere politicians are very vulnerable. They're vulnerable to lies that, oh, that carbon tax is going to destroy the economy, or you're hurting people. And I've got some photos. One is from the Ontario election that got Doug Ford elected, campaigning against a carbon price, and the other are riots in France that would be somebody you would remember. And so when we think about all those challenges and we think about all this, then often people, if I ask, they say, oh, it's very complicated. And here's a quote from Lisa Song, who wrote this in ProPublica. I just picked this. I could have picked any one. Fossil fuels are so integrated into our lives that phasing them out would require us to change everything about how and where we live, how we get around, and how we make money. Now, I mean, how many of you have heard that, or in some guise? Because I would argue, I've heard it so many times said in the media, by people that should know a lot about it. They're basically saying, oh my goodness, this problem is huge. And the whole message of my book is that it is simple. And so for the rest of my talk now, I'm going to talk about why I say it's simple. And then I invite you to take a look at the book, because people have been writing back to me. There's reviews on my webpage, markjaccard.com. where they say the book has been very helpful, and that's been really fun for me to have that kind of feedback. That was my intention, was as an expert to help non-experts see that the problem is much simpler than they're often led to believe. So what is that simple path? Well, first, we have to focus on key actions in some key sectors. As I already said about decarbonization, we basically have to rapidly phase out the burning of coal, oil, and most uses of natural gas. And so, and thank goodness we've now got some movements about coal phase outs, and Canada is a key player in the effort to internationalize that action. Another is we have to phase out gasoline and diesel, and where there's a lot of media right now and news about governments making statements that, in some time frame, we're not going to allow the selling anymore of gasoline and perhaps diesel cars. Now, why did I just focus though on, why would I focus on electricity and transportation? Well, those are the key sectors. First of all, because the technologies and costs are modest in those sectors. Now, it's not as easy in larger trucking and so on. That can be expensive and difficult, but in general. Also, what's important is, I talked about the global nature of the problem. You can act unilaterally in these domestic sectors, unlike in sectors like that you're trying to trade or you're under competition internationally, your production of steel, cement, aluminum, chemicals. If you raise the costs of those industries and other governments are not doing that, in other words, you're a leader in decarbonization, you have a real problem for your industry. And that's why governments everywhere who've been leaders have tended to work on domestic sectors. I picked electricity and transportation. I'm going to show you why. But also that means buildings, some aspects of land use, and so on. So the list is longer than electricity and transportation. But as you can see from my last bullet, electricity and transportation count for greater than 50% of future greenhouse gas emissions. And most of that coming, as I said earlier, from developing countries. So the next slide, I want to go through this quickly. This is a forecast of CO2 emissions if we are sort of on the same path we're on, some progress but not great, in the year 2050. One is OECD, so Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. That just means what we generally used to categorize as industrialized countries. Non-OECD has China included in there. And what you see is those two sectors I talked about, electricity generation and transport, so the red and yellow, are going to be 50% and more of the emissions. So imagine if we are able to decarbonize just those two sectors, which are the easiest to work on domestically because you don't have to have a global trade agreement. That's a simple path. So if you're looking inside your own country and what your own politicians are doing, or if you're advising politicians as I do, that's something that is really important. But you see, a lot of this is all happening in the developing world. So here's what we can do in wealthier countries. How do we make it happen globally is a big challenge. Now, thinking about how we do this domestically, what are the kinds of policies? So I've talked about decarbonization action, so phasing out coal, oil, and gas in some key sectors. But to really do that, we need compulsory policies. And what are they? If you look at the bottom of the diagram there, there are regulations and carbon pricing, one or the other. And so politicians, if they're not climate sincere, will talk about a whole bunch of other stuff. We're going to inform everyone. We're going to make a best effort too. Government will spend some money. We'll give some subsidies for people and put labels on things. These could all be important in and of themselves, but those alone, without regulations and carbon pricing, will not lead to significant decarbonization. So that's a simple message in my book. There is one chapter on policy in the book, and I lay that out. Now, some simple basics from this. As I said, you must have carbon pricing and/or regulation. But carbon pricing is not essential. So some people have said, oh man, if we can't convince all our fellow citizens in Ontario, or enough of them, to vote for the party that wants carbon pricing, then we're going to fail on climate. It's not true. We can equally have regulations, and that's actually what's usually been doing the main work. And I'll show this on this next slide. This is just California. It's both it shows a comparative in a historic and their forecast period to 2025, which is getting close now. And the yellow are different kinds of regulations. In the book, I explain some of these. They're quite flexible. That means they don't say you have to have electric cars. They say you have to have zero emission cars, or you need to reduce the carbon intensity in your energy you use in transportation. It doesn't say whether you need to use biofuels or more electricity or hydrogen or whatever. Cap and trade is a form of carbon pricing. It's carbon tax and cap and trade. So in California, they have cap and trade, and they estimate that it's going to do about 15% of the reductions. The rest of it's happening by regulations. And I can do a similar figure like this for Ontario, Alberta under the Notley government, British Columbia, or the Canadian federal government's policies as well. So now the last parts of my talk. Why are we not following this simple path? And now this takes me back to the main initial message here. For 3 decades, experts have known that we needed a coordinated global effort and that it won't happen voluntarily. They've known that electricity and transportation are achievable and globally critical, and that renewables won't beat fossil fuels without carbon pricing or regulations. This is what we know, and we have known this for 3 decades. So if experts know this, what's holding back global decarbonization? Now, this next slide, I'm going to go really fast. It's deliberate delusions. And any Canadian who's been concerned about climate and is a little bit astute knows that the people who've wanted us to slow down will argue all sorts of bogus stuff, that science is uncertain. And I've spoken at this conference, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, and it was a panel on that. The next fossil fuel project is essential. They'll tell you, we got to build this one. Yeah, we know, yeah, we care about climate, but we got to build this one. Jobs, our economy. We have to wait for major innovations to decarbonize. Lots of people play into that one. And there's no point acting until we have a global agreement. And I've already shown you that you can act without the global agreement, especially in domestic sectors, as we've seen. But now I'm going to go to some of the broader, or the ones that aren't just sort of what I will call disingenuous people who really don't want us to act on climate, to ones of people, even people who are climate concerned, can be very rigid in their positions, and often this is unwarranted. And I'm going to flip through this quickly. I talk about these things in the book. People that we must use nuclear power. Without nuclear power, we're not going to solve this. I've read that a lot, even in the last year, an op-ed in the New York Times. Or we must not use nuclear power. There's no way we can use nuclear power. And ditto for hydropower, for biofuels, for carbon capture and storage, or even the policies for carbon taxes, as I mentioned. And the answer to this is, remember, the fossil fuel industry, those who want to stay on the fossil fuel carbonized path, planet-destroying path, love this rigidity. And so the main message in my book is, don't let perfection be the enemy of good. Then we keep going here. Now, wishful thinking bias. And this relates to things I talked earlier about. And again, I don't have time here to spend time on this. The book elaborates, so I'll just list these off, that energy efficient investments will save money, but that belies the fact that natural gas is dirt cheap. Whenever I do an analysis for someone about energy efficiency in their home, or even a more efficient furnace, I can show, well, where do you think the price of natural gas is going over the next 2 decades? Oh, here's what the experts think. Here's why efficiency doesn't pay itself off. So here's why you need regulations and carbon pricing. And there's a bunch there, and I'm going to skip over them. Apologies, my slides are available, of course, or will be available. And then finally, what I call agenda hitching biases. So this is where people have an objective that's very laudable. I think we should stop population growth, or we should stop eating meat for a whole bunch of reasons. Whether it's care about how we treat animals, about personal health, or even about land use. And so they'll say, well, to solve this, we got to stop eating meat. We have to stop flying in airplanes or driving cars, or economic growth, or we need to abolish capitalism because it's so inequitable. Many of these may be desirable, or aspects of them. But what happens is people say we have to achieve these things in order to decarbonize. And what that does is it just makes it, as I said earlier, the solution way more complicated than it seems. And this helps to explain that quote that I read earlier from ProPublica about, we have to do everything in order to solve this problem. And of course, those people who don't want us to act love agenda hitching, love the extra complexity. This is many chapters in my book go through these particular problems. Now, the other thing we need to do, and this is where if I give a live audience, I get some good laughter, but I usually set this up, I forgot, by saying, now, one of the other things we have to be able to do is identify climate insincere politicians. And then I flip this slide up because I say, and it can be more challenging. Sometimes they help us out by posing together for a photo, and that makes it easy. So then you can just draw circles around their faces and remember who they are. But other times it's not so easy. And so the goal of the book is to help people with that. And what will they do? Well, you can kind of guess from what I've been saying. So I will go fairly quickly. They'll confuse actions and policies. They'll say, like Andrew Scheer in the last federal election said, we're not going to do carbon taxes. We're going to do I forget what he said, clean energy or something like this. But the clean energy comes from, or he said, we're going to do innovation. The innovation comes from the incentives provided by carbon pricing and or some kind of flexible regulation. They'll say we can do it all with non-compulsory policies. Again, we don't need carbon pricing. And they'll exaggerate the cost of things like a carbon tax. And of course, the fossil fuel industry loves these people and will support them. So what is a climate sincere politician? Again, this is the flip side, so I can go quickly. They will do those right policies. They'll also be working on driving the innovation and low cost decarbonization, especially in the trade exposed industries. And they'll be linking to other countries because they'll always have in mind this is a global problem. If I'm phasing out my coal, it doesn't matter. I need others to do that. If I'm phasing out gasoline cars, I need others to do that. I may even need to have the threat of tariffs to do that, and I should be thinking about that. So this leads me to the last couple of slides. One of them is, so let's take a look at a particular politician, the current one. It's fun because when I showed this, like earlier in the year, in fact, at least in a place like Vancouver, everyone booed. And they said, of course, this isn't a climate sincere politician. And of course, I put it up there just to taunt people a bit because maybe it's not so easy. So what has this politician done since 2015? Well, they've really relied on pricing and regulations with rising stringency. So putting in a carbon price, making it nationwide, it's challenged by various governments. It's a political cost. Andrew Scheer and others knew that, but they've done it, and they've also really tried to go global with what they're doing. They're linked to the Paris Agreement, but especially if I look down at specific policies, domestically phasing out our coal plants, they'll all be gone over this decade, and then starting a Powering Past Coal international coalition with the United Kingdom. The economy-wide carbon price I mentioned. Also a system of carbon pricing for industry that makes sure its cost of production doesn't rise dramatically, but gives the right signal. And then various kinds of regulations that they've either implemented or are in the process of doing so. So I tend to end this slide by just taunting people a bit and saying, so what are you going to do? It's not easy. There's no perfect political party out there. You have to think about what your fellow Canadians are voting for and who will get into power instead of the party that might be doing things, some of which are better than what you had in the past. And I would argue that the party we've had federally in government since 2015 is the only government we've had that can be called climate sincere, and even it's not perfect either. But the Chrétien government, the Mulroney government, the Harper government. So you have to kind of, decide how much are you going to let perfection be the enemy of good when you're trying to act as a climate concerned citizen to get climate sincere politicians. Now, I'm going to end it off with the book then talks a lot. It actually has a flow chart. Which I think might even be up it'll be up in some of the slides, but I've removed it here in the interest of time. And the flow chart sort of says, as a citizen, how do I figure out if the politician is climate sincere, and then what do I do? And one of the issues is, what if, you just haven't been able to get a climate sincere politician elected? what is the role of citizens when that happens? So as a citizen, you have to work to elect and support those sincere politicians, push them to implement the flex regs and carbon pricing, push them to make alliances for global coal and gas phase out. And there's been lots of groups that, from speaking I've done and from reading my book, that I've been advising over the last several months. And then what can you do personally? Well, you can do what people like I have done is now, as you've got governments making sure our electricity is generated without emissions, and that's already been the case in Canada, but with the coal phase out, it's coming right across the country. So buying an electric car makes a big difference. Getting an electric heat pump makes a big difference. Those two things are going to account for 80 to 90% of your emissions as an individual. And so no longer can you or your neighbors tell you that they can't get their emissions down. We have that ability. You can even buy a secondhand electric car. Okay. All right, I still have a few minutes here. So here's my last two slides. So what influence can citizen activism have? And I'm ending it with the plea to everyone to understand that no one is too small to make a difference, and never doubt what a group of committed people can do. And so I'll stop now and thank you. And I think I have a bit of time for questions, but I have to remember how to find them. Menu. Oh, someone asked me if in the next federal election I'll consider rating parties and leaders on my personal website. Oh, I'd be happy to do that. And in fact, I'll be doing more than that. In the last federal election, I took Andrew Scheer's climate policy. Oh, I took all of them actually, and I did a modeling. I run my researchers, not me. My grad students and the research team that I have at Simon Fraser University model policies. We do it both independently as academics, but also for governments and for other organizations. And we modeled it to show that Andrew Scheer's policies, none of which were pricing and regulations, of course, led to rising emissions rather than the declines that he claimed. So that's actually where, and I've done that. I did that in the previous election as well. So that's my form of rating them. Yes. So thank you for that question. And perhaps I am out of time. Okay, wait a minute. I see. All right, I don't. Okay, so I can see that I'm coming now to the end of this time. I hope that that this was a help, and what I really wanted to say is a teaser to get you interested in learning more about the book, and if you like it, asking others, and also to interact with me. I'm on Twitter, email as well, and you can see some information there on that final slide. So thank you very much, and I will close out now. Thank you.